Our final speaker is Peter Britz, who is the Environmental Planner and Sustainability Coordinator for the City of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I was talking to Peter earlier. He was letting me know about the comprehensive planning for adaptation that the City of Portsmouth has just completed, and he'll be talking about that. Peter.
Thanks, Jack. So is this the,
Yeah, this one just goes, that's forward, that's backwards.
this the arrow?
That's it, yeah, but use this one.
Okay. All right, great. Hello. So the small city of Portsmouth is going to compete with the big city of Boston and New York here. But we have our own plan. I'm going to have to challenge you to take yourself a little bit back in time and pretend you didn't hear all the storm surge and sea level rise projections. We're pretty much in the same margin. But I want to talk about how we're planning in Portsmouth and how that's worked. Just so I get a sense, how many people have actually been to Portsmouth? Oh, wow. So I don't really need to talk to you about where we're going. You probably know the city pretty well. It's a real popular destination on the seacoast of New Hampshire, obviously for history. It's settled in 1623, and some of the components of the city is the fact that it's really a destination as much as it is an urban area. So the 21,000, it's more of a big city feel for a real small city that it is. There's about 100 destination restaurants and living museum, Strawberry Bank Museum, and quite a bit of other treats if you want to go there in the summer. It's a good place to go. So we'll move on. We completed our adaptation plan in April of last year, and we've been working on outreach with the community. The key on the plan is that it was put together with actually some of the same people that were talked about today. Paul Kirshen from UNH and a couple other UNH professors, Dave Burdick and Tom Ballestero, worked on the engineering and some salt marsh components of the study. Chris Watson also did the GIS for us. And then our Regional Planning Commission helped write the plan with assistance from city staff. The key on this plan for us is the fact that we had federal money to do it. There was 5 communities selected by the Gulf of Maine Council on the Marine Environment to do climate change vulnerability assessments. Portsmouth was one of those communities, and without it, we wouldn't have been able to do the work. So again, another plug for federal money to help communities do this. Every community needs to take a look at this, but it's really not within their purview to do this kind of work. So that money really helped us along. And also, it was the easier argument to convince my bosses and the city council and people in the city who might have been reluctant to take on this type of work. Overall, the concern from the city government was that they didn't know if they wanted to bring out elevation scenarios and show properties and businesses underwater on the mapping that we were going to do. And there was certainly some concern about that, but once we rolled out the study, there was a lot of support. A lot of people really wanted to hear about what the city could do in the future, what they saw as problems coming forward, and what kind of situation we were in. So. And then, of course, Hurricane Sandy helped with the knowledge and the understanding. People wanted to know more, so the timing on that sort of alleviated people's fears and brought their attention to the work a little bit more. So this is a part of Portsmouth, the downtown South End, we call it, and we really haven't seen a lot of overtopping of some of our infrastructure and some of our streets, but you can see how close we are to vulnerability here. This is really a full moon tide. It's not an unusual event that will have water up right at the edge of some seawalls in town. We haven't, fortunately, had a lot of problems with flooding, but as you'll see, we certainly have some serious vulnerabilities. There was quite a bit of discussion about storm surges, and I just want to highlight again here, this is Hurricane Sandy, and so everybody likes to use that moment. We got hit at low tide with Hurricane Sandy, so it was only about 1.5 feet when Hurricane Sandy at our high tide, and then at low tide is where the biggest impact of Hurricane Sandy came for us, and it's about 2 feet or so. So it would have been a more significant event, but again, nothing like New York City saw, or Connecticut or New Jersey. But to prepare people for what could happen in terms of a storm surge, we put together some illustrations. So again, this is Hurricane Sandy. Again, we're at a seawall in the same part of town in the South End. We're right at the top of that seawall. It didn't overtop the seawall. It's right at the top. And this was at the high tide that day. We didn't have much more capacity. So what I tried to do to key people into what could happen is add 2 feet to that, and just to show people what it would look like if 2 feet. This is a really popular spot people drive through on the way to Newcastle. A lot of people know this area, so they could get a sense of, what it would look like to add that much more water. Again, we'd have some flooding. Our storm surge projections were for 6.8 feet for a 100-year coastal storm. So to add on top of that 4 more feet is really where we start to see some problems and we start to really need to do some response. I put together this graphic just to show people, again, if that 6.8-foot 100-year coastal storm came in, it would be up in their first floor in a lot of places in the downtown and the south end. And a real problem to wrestle with is, the fact that we're in a historic community. The real draw to Portsmouth is the history. We have a really strong historic district commission. To tell people that they ought to raise their houses up on stilts, it would really take away from the historic character, really be a problem. So looking at this problem more holistically is something that we're trying to do. So that's the storm surge side of things. And then the sea level side of things, we tried to bring it home with some regional data. Cameron Wake spoke yesterday, and Cameron Wake and Elizabeth Burakowski from UNH put together this regional study of climate change in the Piscataqua Great Bay region, past, present, and future. And so what they did was they looked at some local weather. They looked at the International Panel on Climate Change and brought that information down to the local level using local tidal stations and rainfall events, and tried to get a sense of where our weather and sea level rise would be. What we did in Portsmouth was look at 2 different scenarios that they looked at in that study, the 2050 and the 2100 time frame at a low greenhouse gas emissions and a high greenhouse gas emissions scenario. And what we came up with was essentially the same numbers that were talked about earlier. For Portsmouth, it looked like with a low greenhouse gas emission scenario, about a foot of sea level rise at 2050 and about 1.7 feet at the 2050 timeframe with a sort of a business as usual greenhouse gas emission scenario. And then at 2100, we'd have the 2.5 feet at a low greenhouse gas emission scenario and up to 6.3 feet with a business as usual scenario in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So 6.3 feet, again, that's close to our 100-year coastal storm, coastal flood level. And so up to the first floor, into the first floor of some buildings. As you start to talk about sea level rise, the important message that we wanted to get out to the community is the big difference with a coastal storm versus sea level rise. This is a business in Portsmouth that gets flooded probably every other full moon, or at least on the king tide every year, probably 3 or 4 times a year. It gets some significant flooding in the parking lot. It's a restaurant. People in the city all know this. We show this photo, and they're all aware of it. This was actually a photo. There was a king tide contest in our area, and this photo was the contest winner, just to show some of the impacts and raise awareness about coastal flooding in the area. So on a few time a year basis, this isn't a big deal, but you take this on a daily basis. If this is the high tide every day, this business is going to have some serious impacts, and they're going to have to deal with that. So this is where we wanted to raise awareness, not only at the business level. Even more importantly, I think, in some ways, is the impacts to the salt marsh. A salt marsh, again, can handle a coastal flood on an episodic basis, on a coastal storm basis. When you start to talk about sea level rise, salt marshes have to be able to keep up with that sea level rise, whether they're accreting sediment to grow or whether they're migrating inland or a combination of both. The only way they're going to succeed is if they have a place to go. And so we tried to look at that in our study as well. In looking at the 2 different areas, this just puts together the sea level rise and the storm surge. So the lower graph, these 2 lines are the low and high greenhouse gas emission scenarios, up to the 6.3 feet high over there on 2100, or the low 1 foot 2050. And then up here is the coastal flooding, and that 6.8 feet added to the 6.3 feet is our high right here of 17.6 feet. So in the worst case of all scenarios, we could have close to 18 feet elevation of flooding. And obviously, not something we're looking forward to, but we wanted to lay out the future possibilities for the community. And we did so, looking at this graph, just to show people that in that worst case scenario, not only would you have water up to the first floor, you could have water well into the second floor of these buildings in the south end. So something not to take lightly and to start to be aware of. But again, the message is really just to prepare people and to get people thinking about it, because we need to start putting some ideas in our capital plan. We need to start doing some planning. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But first, I want to show you a little bit of the mapping and how the mapping worked in the community. So what we did was we looked at the entire city to see where we're vulnerable, and really coastal flooding was the area. We looked at buildings and we looked at infrastructure. This is the building map, and I'll show you a little more on the building side. Not unlike Boston and New York City, just on a smaller scale, these are the areas, these first areas hit are areas that were filled back in the 1800s, filled land to make more, wharfing out, or whether they're filling land for development. These are the lowest areas. These are the most vulnerable areas. Common theme again. You can see on this, we'll see it more on the next slide, where you're seeing buildings highlighting or turning black is where the floodwaters have reached up to the lot on those properties, according to our model. And again, this is a bathtub model. So this next series of photos shows all the different elevations we mapped. We didn't map every scenario that we came up with. We mapped these 4 elevations just to keep it a little simpler for people. This is the 7.5 foot. At 11.5 feet, this is closest to that 100-year coastal storm. So this is something that we could, say to people, this on a 100-year coastal storm event, this could happen tomorrow. This is any time. As we move further out, we're combining sea level rise with coastal storms, but we're seeing some real serious impacts. These blue areas here are where you have 9 to 12 feet of standing water over the ground. So this is our south end, again, our most vulnerable part of the city from a developed standpoint. So again, this is the information we got out just to get the message out to people and show them. The next step is to start looking at our infrastructure and do some real capital planning and some master planning that I'll talk about in a little bit. This is the other part of the city. So Portsmouth is fortunate in that it has quite a bit of natural resource area as well as coastal area. So we have an ability to respond to sea level rise in these areas. This is where the salt marsh areas in the city have not been overtaken by development. And there's actually some land up above these areas that, in this case, this is an urban forestry center. It's a natural resource recreation area. You can go, there's walking trails and that type of thing. And on the other side of the creek, there's some open space. Opportunities to put in some either bigger buffers or do some land protection measures, and think about how to allow that salt marsh to migrate so we can at least protect some of the salt marsh. Because again, without the salt marsh and the nursery species here, we're going to have some real problems with our fisheries down the road. So then the next step in the process after we did our maps and did the report was bringing it out to the community. We did a number of public meetings. This is Paul Kirshen speaking to a crowd in our public library. We had a little presentation and an open house where we got a lot of questions and a lot of interest from the public. We also did a couple walking tours. This is in the south end. A lot of the residents in that area came out to take a look at, on the ground, what it would look like, the flooding and where the flooding would be. We went to Strawberry Bank where the puddle dock area is and took a look at the areas that they filled in the past and how high the water would get according to what the study showed. This is an outreach piece that was handed out to the community to get the information into the hands of the public and to direct them to the website where they could get the full report and some additional information. So in terms of recommendations, this is the different recommendations that the report came out with that we're starting to work on. The whole idea with this report when we got the funding was that this report would then tie directly into our master plan. And so we'd have a chapter that I'm skipping ahead here a little bit, but the whole idea is that this isn't a standalone document that we do this work and then set it aside. It's really meant to be integrated. So we'd have a chapter in master plan, but we'd also weave in the recommendations through each section. Resiliency isn't just about coastal flooding. It's about a lot of other components, which we looked a little bit at, but we need to dig in a little bit more on. So in terms of floodplain standards, the real thought is to do an extended flood hazard overlay. So we look at expanding the floodplain beyond what's required by FEMA. A historic district, really looking closely at which properties are going to be impacted and try and determine a plan forward to whether we're going to raise whole neighborhoods at a time or relocate buildings or what really the solution is there to keep Portsmouth with the same feel that it has today. Setbacks and buffers, I talked a little bit about this, but really thinking about the salt marsh areas and how we're going to protect those, whether we're going to have a 100-foot buffer. We have a 100-foot buffer now on our salt marshes, but will we take that another 100 feet in areas where we can gain some salt marsh migration area and that type of thing. So talking about that with our Conservation Commission and then working it into the planning process. Redevelopment standards, this is really meant to talk speak to our capital planning efforts, and sort of there was some talk of this earlier, is a cost-benefit analysis of our infrastructure and the improvements needed to start to take a look at which infrastructure needs upgrading. Obviously, our sewer pump stations are at the low point. We're already thinking about those, but then moving ahead, what's the next step? Which roads get fixed first? The more we do now, the more we save in the future, another theme today that we've heard. So that's really a sort of a path forward for our Public Works Department more than anyone, and for developers and other people, but really for us, the cost-benefit piece is key. And then shoreline protection options. We're going to hear more and more, and we've heard today, sort of not divergence, but different ideas on how to protect shoreline areas and different methodologies moving forward. And, who's going to want to build seawalls, who's going to want to put riprap and armoring, who's going to be amenable to green infrastructure or some, whether it's shellfish reefs or artificial reefs. What are the first requests we're going to look like? And rather than respond to them, let's be ready for them. So our Conservation Commission's already started talking about this and sort of getting in place a methodology to do this. There's actually, I should make a little plug for this, there's going to be a coastal hardening conference coming up in New Hampshire. We have a pretty active climate change adaptation work group in New Hampshire. Given that they're such small communities, there's not a lot of staff in most of these communities to do this work. So the work's been taken on by an ad hoc basis by a number of different state, federal, and nonprofits and researchers. We put on a number of workshops and trying to bring information to the communities in more depth than the communities can kind of do themselves. They're going to look at shoreline armoring and hardening and sort of the best solutions going forward with the eye on climate change and climate change adaptation. Again, I've talked about the master plan and the coastal wetlands. Public health, we really didn't delve into, and one of the shortcomings of this report, I guess, is that it really is a coastal flooding report more than anything from a climate change adaptation standpoint. The money came from the Gulf of Maine Council. It was appropriate that we looked at coastal flooding, but we need to do some more work on our public health impacts and public health threats we have, and take a look at other adaptation measures that we need to put in place in the community. And so that's being left on here. And then in emergency management and hazard mitigation, we are going to update our hazard mitigation plan. It's a real opportunity for us. Just like was mentioned before, our FEMA planning and our hazard mitigation planning looks at the past as the sort of the way to plan for the future, when we should be looking at the future, given things are changing faster than we're preparing for. So we're going to integrate some of the findings of the study into our hazard mitigation planning and look at combination in terms of our evacuation planning and that type of thing, on how to best meet that need. So I went through things pretty quickly here. I know we're behind on time, but we'll have time for questions. And I wanted to give you a link to the website. The full report's on there at this planportsmouth.com/CRI. And then the work group that I talked about, the Coastal Adaptation Work Group, is housed on the New Hampshire Storm Smart Coast website. Two good resources in terms of New Hampshire. So that's it.